The lowers. The lowers existed to remove arrogance. They did not do it loudly or theatrically. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic displays of dominance, and no attempts to break the spirit through volume. Instead, the lowers operated with a patience that felt almost cruel, a slow, methodical stripping away of ego, until only the barest essentials of discipline remained. The training area was carved into the hills near Camp Merrill, a wasteland of scarred rock faces and jagged ledges. Rope anchors had been drilled into the stone decades earlier by men who had learned, sometimes fatally, what happened when technique failed. Moss clung to the shaded crevices like a damp shroud, and water seeped constantly through the cracks, turning the rock into a slick, treacherous surface even when the sky was clear. There were no crowds here, no cheering sections, no cinematic elevations. There was only gravity, and gravity is a law that does not accept appeals. The wolves arrived before dawn. The moment the 16 stepped off from Camp Frank D. Merrill, the terrain ceased to be geography and became an opponent, their breath fogging in the biting mountain air. They were already calorie-starved from the transition at Derby, their temperaments frayed by the uncertainty of the phase ahead. They were genetically engineered for the most extreme environments on Earth. They expected to be challenged, but they expected that challenge to be one of strength, speed, or endurance. Instead, they were handed rope, coils of it, thick, worn and stiff with the grime and sweat of 1,000 students who had stood where they now stood. Carabiners clinked dully as they were issued. Webbing slapped against their fatigues. Harnesses were thrown down like common tools, devoid of ceremony. A ranger instructor stood at the edge of the precipice, his hands clasped calmly behind his back, staring out over the drop. "You fall here," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You don't bounce." No one laughed. The gravity of the statement settled over them instantly. The first day did not involve the wall. It involved knots, hours of them. The wolves knelt in the dirt, their fingers numb from the damp cold, tying and untying under instructions that were relentlessly, agonizingly precise. Figure-8 follow-throughs had to be dressed perfectly, each strand parallel, each loop tight. Tails had to be measured to the inch. Load paths were explained, then tested, then explained again. Mistakes were not met with shouting. They were corrected in a whisper, then repeated until the error disappeared. "Tying knots is thinking," an RI said, his shadow falling over a wolf whose hands were shaking. "If you rush, it shows. If you panic, it shows. The rope doesn't care about your intent. It only cares about the physics of the knot." Then the variables shifted. Gloves were added, making the rope slippery and the movements clumsy. Then the gloves were taken away, leaving skin exposed to the abrasive bite of the rope. Finally, they were told to tie blind, eyes closed, fingers memorizing texture, friction, and sequence. They had to feel the knot into existence, trusting their touch over their sight. Rain began midway through the morning, not a storm, but a persistent, soaking drizzle that turned the rope fibers into sponges and the dust at their feet into a grey paste. No shelter was offered. They stayed in the rain, tying and retying until the motions became a part of their muscle memory. By afternoon, anchors were introduced. They were taught to identify the lie of the mountain. Trees that looked solid but were rotting from the inside. Rocks that seemed immovable but shifted under a real load. They were forced to build redundant systems based on the absolute assumption that something would fail. "Build it for when you're wrong," the RI commanded, "not for when you're right." The wolves learned to think in layers, primary anchors, backup points, secondary redundancies, load sharing. They were taught that a single point of failure was not a mistake. It was a death sentence. That night, sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. Cold seeped through their damp uniforms, and as they drifted into a shallow, exhausted haze, their fingers continued to twitch, unconsciously mimicking the patterns of the knots. Day 2 brought the wall. It wasn't the dramatic cliff they had imagined, but a sheer drop of grey rock that simply vanished beneath their boots. The edge erased their depth perception, making the ground below feel both impossibly distant and terrifyingly final. The first rappels were slow, painfully slow. Brake hands burned as friction ate through skin. Boots scraped the rock with an uncertain, scratching sound. Their bodies leaned back into empty space, their primal instincts screaming against the posture they had been drilled into minutes earlier. For a predator, leaning back into a void is an act of madness. Some wolves froze. Not openly, they didn't panic, but they hesitated, just long enough for the RI to notice. The instructor didn't intervene immediately. He waited, letting the fear settle, letting the hesitation grow until it became a wall. Then, a single word. Commit. The word carried the weight of an order. They stepped back. Gravity took over, a sudden, violent pull that threatened to rip them from the ledge. But the rope held. It held because they had tied it correctly. Trust grew slowly, built on a foundation of technical success. Then, the complexity increased. They moved to Australian rappels, facing outward, leaning their bodies away from the rock, controlling their descent through posture and balance rather than fear. They practiced body rappels, where the rope burned across their fatigues and their skin, and where muscle memory mattered more than comfort. Weapons were added. Slung awkwardly, the rifles caught on the rock, pulling, their balance off-center and forcing them to fight the gear while fighting the drop. Then came the rucks, heavy, unforgiving loads that shifted at the worst possible moments, threatening to flip them upside down in midair. Night iterations erased the remaining visual cues. Headlamps were forbidden. NVGs distorted the depth, turning the rock into a green, undulating blur. Shadows lied. Commands became the only thing they could trust. On rope. Wait. Repelling. If a single call was missed, the system stopped cold. One wolf clipped in incorrectly. Nothing catastrophic, but a flaw in the sequence. The RI stepped in instantly. Stop! Everything froze. Hands locked on the rope. Breathing became shallow. That, the RI said calmly, pointing to the misplaced carabiner, would have killed the man below you. There was no yelling. There was only the truth. From that moment on, the checks doubled. Harnesses were inspected without being told. Knots were rechecked 3 times before every movement. Carabiners were oriented with deliberate intent, never rushed. The trust shifted. It was no longer about individual confidence in their own strength, but a collective discipline in the system. Midway through the lowers, the focus shifted to casualty evacuation. This was where their strength failed them and coordination took over. Simulated wounded were dead weight, limbs awkward, bodies uncooperative, simulating the limpness of a dying man. Lowering a casualty required communication, so clean it bordered on ritual. Lowering. Lowering. Stop. The rope burned slower, but the static load made their muscles shake. Sweat ran into their eyes in the freezing wind. They learned a brutal reality. A mistake during a lower didn't kill the carrier. It killed the casualty. That reality settled deep in their bones. Leadership emerged here, not through volume or aggression, but through a terrifyingly steady calm. The wolves who had dominated the physical phases of the course struggled here. The ones who could slow the platoon down, control their breathing, and maintain a rhythmic, steady descent rose quietly to the top. A leader who rushed was relieved of command. A leader who hesitated too long failed just as completely. Day after day, the lowers repeated. Different angles, worse weather, shorter time limits. Rain turned to sleet during one iteration, soaking through their gloves and stealing the dexterity from their fingers. "Cold kills fine motor skills," the RI remarked. "Plan for it." They adapted. Knots were simplified, but reinforced. Movements were exaggerated to compensate for the numbness. Communication was tightened into a series of sharp, unmistakable signals. The final days combined every stressor: night, rain, time pressure, simulated enemy contact, casualties mid-descent. During one final run, a wolf slipped. Not a full fall, but a moment where his boots lost purchase and his weight shifted unexpectedly, sending him swinging violently against the rock. The rope caught him, the jolt snapping through the line. Silence followed. He recovered, regained his footing, and continued the descent. At the top, his hands shook, not from fear, but from the sudden, vivid understanding of how thin the line was between a successful mission and a fatal error. The final iteration ended just before dawn. No speeches followed, no acknowledgement was given. The wolves coiled their ropes with hands that no longer fumbled. Harnesses were stowed automatically. Carabiners were clipped without a second thought. They had not conquered the lowers. They had been educated by them. They had learned that courage meant nothing without control. They learned that strength was a useless tool without a system to direct it. They learned that true leadership was not the ability to dominate chaos, but the ability to slow it down. Above them, higher, more treacherous terrain waited, and there the lowers would stop being a training exercise. They would become the only thing keeping them alive. The mountain phase. Combat patrols. The mountains did not rise to meet them. They closed in. The moment the 16 stepped off from Camp Frank D. Merrill, the terrain ceased to be geography and became an opponent. It did not attack with sudden violence. Instead, it exerted a quiet, relentless pressure. Every direction sloped. Every step was a negotiation, either a lean downhill that strained the ankles or a climb that burned the calves and lungs without ever offering the reward of a summit. For the wolves, the environment was an assault on the senses. Cold mist threaded through the pines, clinging to fur-lined collars and soaking into exposed skin. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine, ancient rot, and cold stone, smells that, in their shifted forms, would have told them exactly where every deer and predator lay for 3 miles. Now, trapped in human skin, those scents were merely reminders of what they were being denied. Breath steamed and vanished in the grey light. Sound behaved erratically, carrying a whisper across a valley, only to swallow a shout in a thicket of brush. This was not terrain one crossed. This was terrain that kept you. The first patrol began without the luxury of acclimation. There was no easing in, no getting the lay of the land. A ranger instructor, RI, handed over a map, his gloved finger tapping a grid with a clinical detachment, and issued a 2-word command: "You're moving." Leadership rotated with a frequency designed to induce vertigo. A wolf would find himself the patrol leader, PL, before he had time to resent the responsibility. Orders were issued in low, deliberate tones. The patrol stepped off in a staggered file, spacing tight, pace conservative, a calculated rhythm intended to preserve the very energy they were already losing. By the end of the first movement, the physical toll arrived. Legs burned. Packs, laden with gear and ammunition, rode heavier than the laws of physics should allow. Sweat cooled. Instantly beneath rain shells, leaching warmth from their cores. The mountains took note of their struggle, and in response, they allowed the patrol to continue. That night, the rain began. It wasn't a storm. It was a drizzle, a persistent, clinging moisture that wasn't hard enough to justify a complaint, but wasn't light enough to ignore. It was the kind of rain that ensured nothing ever dried again. By morning, the leather of their boots had softened, and the moisture had begun to migrate inward. The second patrol felt deceptively easier. The muscles that had screamed the night before had entered a state of numb cooperation. Joints loosened. The wolves moved faster, their natural predatory confidence bleeding back into their stride. That confidence was a trap. A descent that appeared manageable turned into a slide of slick, wet leaves and loose shale. One wolf lost his footing, sliding 10 feet down a ravine before arresting himself on a thicket of mountain laurel. He came to a halt with shredded gloves and skin torn from his palms. It wasn't an injury worth reporting, not to the RI, and certainly not to his teammates. He stood up, wiped the blood on his trousers, and fell back into step. The lesson arrived regardless. Relief was a lie. By the third movement cycle, the hunger manifested. It didn't arrive as a sharp pain, but as a pervasive cognitive fog. Thoughts slowed. The fine lines on the map began to blur and swim. Simple decisions, where to place a flank, when to halt, took seconds longer than they should have. The patrol leader, fighting the haze, misjudged the terrain. He trusted the azimuth over the ground truth. The ridge looked correct. The compass was clean. He led them forward, confident in the math. He was wrong. The patrol drifted into a deep, hidden bowl that killed their radio line of sight and forced a brutal, vertical climb to regain their position. Time bled away. Energy, already depleted, vanished. The RI let it happen. He watched from the periphery, a shadow in the trees, recording every hesitation. Only when the patrol missed its designated checkpoint did he stop them. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't offer a correction. He looked at the exhausted line of men and asked a single question. Who checked him? No one answered. The silence was heavier than the packs. By then, the rain had soaked through every layer of clothing. Socks squelched with every step. Blisters split and bled, the skin softening and tearing under the friction of the march. The packs grew heavier by the hour, not because the weight had increased, but because the bodies were failing to recover. Sleep came in fragments. 10 minutes of shallow, twitching unconsciousness here. 20 there. Dreams were jagged and unfinished. The mountains pressed closer, the canopy narrowing, the air growing thinner. By the 5th night, the wolves stopped speaking, unless the mission demanded it. Words were a luxury. They cost. Calories they didn't have. Hand signals replaced whispers. A primal, unspoken presence replaced verbal instruction. That was when the first real fracture appeared. During a tactical halt, a wolf slipped on wet shale and slammed shoulder first into a pine tree. The sound of the impact, the dull thud of bone on wood, echoed. He hissed once, a sound that was almost a growl, then straightened himself. He finished the patrol without a word, his jaw locked so tight it looked like it might crack. At the patrol base, a medic glanced at the bruising. "You good?" "Yes." He wasn't. But the mountains did not reward honesty. They only rewarded endurance. Leadership failures grew subtler, more insidious. Orders were issued too quickly, lacking clarity. Spacing compressed as the men instinctively huddled for warmth. Noise increased by fractions of a decibel. The clink of a canteen, the scrape of a boot, errors that would be fatal in a real engagement. One wolf snapped at another, during a halt. Not a shout, but a sharp, jagged edge of aggression, that cut through the silence. The RI wrote something in his notebook. That night, those two wolves were placed in adjacent leadership roles. They were forced to rely on the very person they resented. They worked together without further incident, but the tension remained, a live wire humming between them. Harmony was not the objective. Function was. By the 7th cycle, the patrols turned aggressive. A night raid was ordered. Seize and clear a simulated enemy camp positioned on a narrow saddle between two ridgelines. The insertion was late. Night vision goggles washed the world into a grainy green distortion. Fog rolled across the slope, flattening depth and swallowing sound, turning the forest into a surreal, featureless void. The wolves moved anyway, their instincts fighting the limitations of the gear. But the exhaustion had finally eroded their edge. Security failed by a matter of seconds. A simulated sentry fired first. Compromised. The patrol didn't panic. They adapted. Instead of a blind charge, they maneuvered uphill, using the elevation to flank the position. It was messy. It was slow. It was agonizingly exhausting. But it worked. When the RI froze the lane, there was no celebration. Knees shook. Hands trembled from a combination of cold and extreme calorie debt. The RI looked at the patrol leader, his eyes devoid of praise. "Messy," the RI said. "Yes, sir," the leader replied, his voice hoarse. "But you didn't panic." "No, sir." The RI nodded once. It was the closest thing to a compliment they had received in a week. By now the hunger was no longer background noise. It was personal. It was a predatory thing living inside their stomachs, chewing on their patience. Tempers shortened. Decisions felt like lifting boulders. One wolf caught himself staring at a map for 3 full minutes, unable to remember the decision he had just made. On Ahadhamd, narrow ridgeline movement, the shale gave way under the rear element. A wolf slid, his world tilting, stopped only by a desperate grab at a root and his own webbing. He didn't fall. He wasn't injured. But the patrol froze. For 5 seconds, the entire unit stopped, paralyzed by the suddenness of the slip. That hesitation echoed louder than the slide itself. The RI ended the patrol early. "You paused," he said quietly. That was the only critique. The final movement began before dawn on the 10th day. The cold bit deeper now, a freezing wind that sought out every gap in their clothing. Breath came ragged. Hands shook uncontrollably, not from fear, but from a systemic collapse, caused by exhaustion, layered atop hunger, layered atop sleep deprivation. The wolves moved anyway. Their orders were shorter now, quieter, more precise. No one tried to force a pace. No one tried to impress the instructors. They completed the patrol through a grim negotiation with the land, reading the terrain, adjusting their tempo, and conserving their remaining energy like it was the last of their ammunition. At the extraction point, the RI looked them over. He didn't see soldiers. He saw equipment that had been pushed to the point of failure and had somehow held together. No speech, no ceremony, just a single sentence. Combat patrols complete. The wolves stood there, soaked through, hollow-eyed, breathing with the labored heaviness of old men. They had learned what no classroom at Derby could teach. Fatigue lies. Hunger erodes judgment. Terrain amplifies every mistake. And above all, they learned that the mountain does not break you quickly. It is not a hammer. It is a grinder. It lets you destroy yourself slowly, piece by piece, unless you learn how to move inside the misery. Mobility training. The mountain doesn't hate you. It just doesn't care if you survive it. The first thing the wolves realized about the mountains of North Georgia was that they were alive. Not in the poetic sense, not in some mystical, whispering wind way, but alive in the way something ancient and monolithic watches you fail and never once adjusts itself to help. It was a cold, geological indifference that stripped away the illusion of their superiority. Mobility training began without ceremony. There was no speech, no motivational build-up, no roadmap of what was to come. There was only rope. Thick, static lines dropped into the sludge at the base of a ridge that rose like a wall of soaked earth and exposed shale. The incline was punishing, a vertical sprawl of grey rock and clinging vines that seemed to actively repel ascent. "Your problem is down there," the ranger instructor said, his voice flat, pointing into a ravine that swallowed the remaining light of the afternoon. "Your solution is in your hands." The wolves looked at the rope, then they looked at each other. Finally, they looked at the mountain. Naira was the first to move. It wasn't out of a desire to lead, but because she knew that in this cold, hesitation was a contagion. It multiplied. She ran her gloved hand along a pine trunk, testing the grip of the bark and the integrity of the root structure. She crouched low, digging her fingers into the freezing soil at the base to feel the stability of the earth. "Good hold," she said quietly. Her voice was a low anchor for the others. Joran stepped beside her, his eyes scanning the rock faces for secondary anchor points. The mountain phase had changed him. It had pushed something inward, carving out a silence in him that was deeper and more dangerous than his usual reserve. He didn't speak. He simply pointed to a granite shelf that could hold a cam. Kyle uncoiled the rope with a rhythmic, practiced precision. "Primary, anchor here, back up there, equalize." They built the system methodically. Overhand on a bite, figure 8 follow-through. Safety knots dressed and set with obsessive care. Carabiners locked with a metallic snap that echoed in the silence of the ravine. Saela double-checked every tie, her eyes narrowing as she searched for a single flaw that could lead to a fall. When she finished, she looked at Naira. A single, sharp nod. The first descent belonged to Rick. He slung his rifle tight against his chest, clipped in, and leaned back over the void. For a heartbeat, gravity tested him, pulling at his center of mass, trying to drag him into the depths. Boots searched for purchase on the slick rock. His breath fogged the air in ragged bursts. Then he stepped into the nothingness. The rope stretched slightly under his weight. Above, Kyle controlled the delay, his muscles tensing as he managed the friction. No one spoke. Halfway down, a rock broke loose under Rick's boot and vanished into the ravine. Silence swallowed the sound of the fall. Rick didn't panic. He didn't gasp. He simply adjusted his weight, found a new point of contact, and continued his descent. When his boots touched the bottom, there was no celebration. He simply unclipped and signaled up. One down. The mountain remained indifferent. The next lesson came with a heavier weight. Canvas-wrapped, sand-filled bags strapped into mock casualty harnesses. 200 pounds of dead weight that fought every movement. "You're wounded," the RI said, gesturing to the bags. "Move him." This wasn't a test of strength. They had strength in abundance. This was a test of systems. It was about how they managed a load when the terrain wanted to pull it down. Naira called the play. "Build a 3-to-1 haul." Joran moved to anchor control, his frame bracing against the slope. Kyle and Rick took the pull. The rope tightened, humming with tension. The load shifted, then suddenly stuck, the mud suctioning the harness to the slope like a predator's grip. Saela repositioned herself below, clearing rock and debris with her bare hands. Her fingers bled where the skin had cracked from the cold, the red stark against the grey stone. "Reset tension," Joran ordered. They adjusted. They pulled again. Inches were gained in agonizing increments. Minutes bled into an hour. Halfway up, Rick's boots slipped on a patch of moss. The line jerked violently. The anchor shifted an inch. Everything froze. Naira's heart slammed against her ribs. If that anchor failed, the casualty would drop, and the shock load could tear whoever was attached to the line right off the mountain. "Hold," she breathed, her voice a sliver of steel. Joran's voice was calm. Too calm. "Reinforce secondary." Kaylee scrambled, wrapping webbing around a deeper root cluster and clipping in redundancy. Only when both anchors were secure did Naira allow them to move again. They finished the haul in a heavy, oppressive silence. No one cheered. There was only the sound of shared, ragged breathing. Later that night, Rick stared into the void as he cleaned mud from his weapon. "Feels like the mountain wants one of us," he muttered. Sayela glanced at him, her eyes tired. "It doesn't want anything," she said. "That's worse." The rain returned without warning, cold, relentless sheets that blurred the world. By morning, the small stream they had crossed easily the day before had swollen into a chest-high, churning current of brown water and debris. The RI pointed to the torrent. "Cross." They rigged a tensioned rope line upstream. Kyle entered first, angling his body against the current, clipped in with a carabiner. The water slammed into him like a physical body check, stealing the air from his lungs. He fought forward, his boots sliding on the submerged riverbed. Naira followed, her hand white-knuckled on the rope, her boots searching for rocks that shifted under her. Wait! Midway across, Sayela lost her footing. The current seized her, pivoting her body violently downstream. The rope snapped taut, jerking her back. Joran lunged without thinking, grabbing her plate carrier and anchoring his own weight backward into the mud. For a second, they were horizontal against the rushing water, two bodies fighting a river. Then the system held. They moved as one, an unspoken synchronization born of necessity. No words, just survival. When they reached the far bank, Sayela's lips were a ghostly blue. She refused help standing. "I'm fine," she said. She wasn't, but no one called her on it. In the mountains, the only truth that mattered was whether you could keep moving. Then came the NVGs. Night vision goggles changed the geometry of the world. Depth flattened into a grainy green distortion. Edges blurred. The rope looked solid until your hand closed on nothing. Naira missed a backup knot inspection in the green haze. The RI saw it. He walked forward, and without a word of warning, he unclipped the line and let it fall. Again. No anger. No volume. Just a cold instruction to repeat the failure until it became a success. Fatigue was no longer a sudden crash. It was a subtle, systemic erosion. Hands shook during fine tasks. Tempers sparked over nothing. Joran snapped at Rick for misrouting a piece of webbing. Rick snapped back, the friction of their personalities finally igniting. The argument lasted 4 seconds. Then Kyle stepped between them, his presence a wall. "Not here," Kyle said. They reset. They rebuilt. Under the eerie green glow, in the freezing air, with muscles screaming for calories they didn't have, they worked. The second build was perfect. Then the mountain took its toll. Rick went down on a wet slope, his foot catching in a fissure. His knee twisted under him, with a sharp, audible pop that seemed to echo through the trees. He didn't scream, but he went pale, his breath hitching. The RI approached, examined the joint quickly, and stood up. "Not broken," he said. "Functional," which meant keep moving. Now the casualty wasn't a sandbag. It was one of their own. The dynamic changed instantly. The survival math became personal. Joran adjusted the carry plan. "Rotate every 15. Naira took the first lift. Rick's arm wrapped around her shoulders, his weight dead and heavy. He was heavier than the sandbags because he was breathing and because he was consumed by shame. "I'm slowing you down," he muttered into her shoulder. "No," Naira said quietly. "You're reminding us why this matters." They moved him across 2 ridgelines, through mud that tried to swallow their boots whole. When they set him down at a halt, Saela checked his knee without speaking, her touch clinical and efficient. Kylie redistributed the weight from Rick's pack to his own without being asked. This wasn't heroism. It was the cold calculation of a unit that refused to leave a piece of itself behind. Exhaustion peaked. Joran miscalculated the rope length on a traverse, and they came up short. They were forced to re-anchor mid-slope, exposed to the open elements with the wind cutting sideways through their gear. Naira looked at him, not accusingly, but with a steady, demanding clarity. "Talk it through." He swallowed, the pride leaving him. He adjusted the math and finished the build correctly. Later that night, alone for a moment, Joran stared at his hands. They were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs until the tremor stopped, realizing that leadership here wasn't about being loud. It was about being the one who didn't break. Mount Yona loomed ahead, a sheer face of unforgiving grey stone. They were tasked to rappel under NVGs, 3,000 feet above sea level, where the air thinned and the wind gusted unpredictably. Saela stepped to the edge first. She clipped in, leaned back into the darkness, and for a second she simply disappeared over the lip. Naira watched the rope, her eyes tracking the tension. The movement was steady, controlled. Saela reached the bottom and signaled up. One by one they followed. Kylie hesitated at the edge, only for a single breath. Then he leaned back and trusted the system they had built together. The mountain didn't care if he fell, but the wolves did. Food was gone. Sleep was measured in minutes. Rick stumbled during a final litter carry, dropping his side. The load hit the ground hard. Joran reacted instantly. "Focus!" It was too sharp, too public. Rick's eyes flashed. "You think I'm not trying?" The tension hovered, a live wire ready to snap. Naira stepped in before the fracture could widen. "We fix it, then we talk." They reset the litter and moved again. Later, at a brief halt, Joran approached Rick. No witnesses, no audience. "I'm pushing because I can't afford to lose you," Joran said. Rick nodded once. "Then don't." That was enough. By the end, they spoke less, not from resentment, but from efficiency. Commands were reduced to single, sharp words. Set, on rope, move, hold. They moved a full formation across a narrow ridgeline using fixed ropes. Each wolf was now responsible not just for their own life, but for the spacing, the tension, and the interval discipline of the man behind them. This wasn't squad movement anymore. It was the birth of platoon thinking. They crossed without incident because they had stopped trying to dominate the terrain. They had started respecting it. The final evolution was a continuous movement. No scheduled halts, no respite. The rain returned, seeping into their bones. At hour 8, Naira's hands were so numb she struggled to tie a simple figure 8. Saela saw it and took over silently. At hour 10, Kyler's breathing became ragged, his lungs burning. Rick noticed and shifted extra weight from Kyle's gear to his own, without a word. At hour 12, Joran's voice cracked while giving an order. Naira finished the sentence for him. No ego, no pride. Just preservation. They reached the final ridgeline at dusk. They were mud-streaked and hollow-eyed. Rick's knee was swollen to twice its size. Saela's knuckles were split and bleeding. Kale's shoulders were bruised deep purple from rope tension. Joran's jaw was locked tight from the sheer effort of holding himself together. Naira looked at them. She really looked. They were thinner, they were harder, but they were closer. The RI approached them, looking over the broken, exhausted line of hybrids. "You can move yourselves," he said. He paused. "You can move your wounded." Another pause. "But next, you'll move as something bigger than a squad." He let the word hang in the air. Platoon, control, coordination, under starvation, under cold, under command. The wolves didn't cheer. They didn't smile. They just stood there, breathing the thin mountain air that didn't care if they lived or died. But they had learned something the mountain couldn't take from them. They had learned how to carry each other. And in the mountains, that is everything. Platoon operations. The mountain didn't care that they were wolves. It didn't care that their bones could knit in hours, that their muscle fibers regenerated with a speed that defied human biology, or that their senses could pick up the scent of a copper shell casing from a mile away. To the North Georgia wilderness, biological superiority was irrelevant. The mountain only cared about weight. It cared about gravity. It cared about the steady, eroding theft of time. By the time platoon operations began, the wolves had existed in the high country long enough to lose the concept of clean. Their uniforms were no longer fabric. They were stiff shells of dried mud, salt, and sweat. Their palms were a map of rope burns and calluses. Their knees carried bruises that had healed twice, only to be reopened a third time by the unrelenting terrain. At Derby, they had been tested as squads, tight, instinctive cells. But Mountain Phase was designed to test them as something far more fragile, a platoon. 40 bodies, 4 squads, a rotating carousel of leaders, one mission clock that never stopped ticking, and a level of complexity that made the squad-level movements look like child's play. The Frago arrived just before dusk, delivered with the clinical coldness of a death warrant. Rain was sweeping in from the west, and a thick, suffocating fog already clung to the ridgelines, erasing the horizon. The 5th Ranger Training Battalion instructors handed over the operations order with zero guidance. No hints, no coaching, just the raw requirements. Platoon-level raid, objective Pine Ridge, enemy strength unknown. Step off 2100. The designated platoon leader for the first rotation was Elowen. He took the map in a grip that was steady, though his shoulder, a legacy of the cold in Syria, tightened as the temperature plummeted. He didn't acknowledge the pain. He never did. He simply stared at the contour lines, processing the geometry of the attack. Naira watched him from a distance. She wasn't questioning his capability. She was measuring his intent. Elowen stepped away with his squad leaders, Joran, Saela, and Marcus. This was a different kind of war. He was no longer just leading his brothers and sisters. He had to synchronize 4 separate maneuver elements across restrictive terrain where radio signals died in the ravines and timelines evaporated on the inclines. He briefed the plan with confidence. Perhaps too much. Elowen had underestimated the gap between phase line red and the support by fire position. On the map, it was a mere 800 meters, a short stroll for a hybrid. In reality, it was a near vertical forested slope of loose shale and washed-out footing that turned a stroll into a crawl. They stepped off at 2,100. Within 30 minutes, the platoon began to stretch. Marcus's squad fell behind, struggling to negotiate massive deadfall and steep, treacherous switchbacks. Saela's element moved too quickly, their predatory pace, pushing them ahead until they lost visual contact with the trail element. Radio checks crackled with static, then dropped into a dead silence as the terrain masked every transmission. Elowen, feeling the clock bleed away, tried to accelerate the movement. That was the fatal mistake. Fatigue was already eating them alive. They had survived the day on half an MRE. Their sleep had been 3 fragmented hours spent shivering under ponchos. By pushing the pace, Elowen fractured the cohesion of the unit. By the time they reached the objective area, they were 35 minutes late. The support by fire element was out of position. The assault element arrived breathless, their lungs burning, unable to control their cadence. Security arcs overlapped incorrectly, leaving blind spots that a real enemy would have exploited in seconds. The raid was disjointed. It was a series of disconnected actions rather than a single, synchronized hammer blow. The RIS didn't intervene. They simply let the failure play out in full. After exfiltration, soaked and hollow, the platoon gathered under a stand of dripping pines. The senior RI approached Elowen. "Who verified the terrain?" Elowen's jaw tightened, the muscle pulsing. "I did." "Did you physically recon the elevation profile?" "No." "Then you didn't verify." The words weren't loud, but they were precise. They were a scalpel, cutting away Elowen's confidence. Elowen nodded once. He had learned the first lesson of platoon command. The map is a liar, and confidence is not a substitute for verification. 2 nights later, Naira took the platoon leader role. She had watched Elowen's failure with a hawk's intensity. She did not rush the planning. She walked the terrain model twice, forcing each squad leader to repeat back their routes, their contingencies, and their expected timelines. She identified every piece of dead space and adjusted her schedule with a deliberate, calculated pessimism. Joran watched her, understanding the invisible weight she was now carrying. Platoon leadership meant responsibility for 40 lives, even in training, even when the ammunition was blank. The fatigue was now compounding. While the wolves healed physically, healing did not erase sleep debt. Their hybrid metabolism burned calories at an alarming rate, and the provided rations were a joke. Hunger was no longer a sensation. It was a constant, low-frequency hum beneath every single thought. The step-off was clean. The movement was slower, but it was synchronized. At 0200, a fog rolled down the ridge like a living thing, reducing visibility to 10 meters. A human platoon would have been paralyzed by disorientation. The wolves felt the urge to adapt through instinct, to use scent recognition and the psychic pull of the pack bond to find one another. But Naira refused to let them lean on their biology. "Control your interval," she whispered over the internal comms. "Discipline over instinct. Do not hunt. March." They reached the assault position exactly on time. The raid executed with a cold, mechanical cohesion. It wasn't perfect, but it was controlled. Afterward, as they moved down the ridgeline through a freezing rain, Naira's hands began to shake. It wasn't the cold, it was the delayed crash of adrenaline. Saela fell into step beside her. "You're good," Saela murmured. Naira didn't respond. She was discovering the hidden cost of command. Leadership was isolation. The higher you climbed in the chain, the further you moved away from the pack. By day 6 of platoon operations, the hunger became a visible entity. Marcus grew unnervingly quiet. Joran became sharper, his words clipped and jagged. Saela began to conserve every single movement, speaking only when the mission demanded it. Elowen's patience had thinned to a translucent thread. The RIS sensed the degradation and increased the complexity. Missions now required splitting the platoon across multiple elevations, one squad conducting deep recon, one establishing support, and one maneuvering to flank. Time-distance calculations had to be surgical. A single late element would compromise the entire operation. During one night movement, Marcus miscalculated his pace count over uneven terrain. His squad drifted 5 degrees right of the azimuth. It was a small error, but in the mountains, small errors are amplified. The platoon halted. Radio silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Naira, now serving as platoon sergeant, felt the tension spike across the formation like static electricity. "Adjust left 5 degrees," she whispered into the comms. They corrected. The mistake was contained, but the psychological blow remained. During the after-action review, AAR, the RI looked at Marcus. "What happened?" "I trusted my stride length," Marcus replied. "Why?" Silence. The answer was that he was exhausted, that hunger had eroded his precision, that even a wolf's brain degrades when deprived of sleep and calories. But Marcus didn't say that. "I didn't confirm terrain interference," he answered. The RI nodded. "Platoon operations require verification, always." By the second week, the emotional fatigue surfaced. The rotations meant every wolf eventually carried the burden of command. Saela's turn came during a brutal cold snap where the temperature dropped well below freezing. Wet boots never dried. Fingers stiffened into claws around weapon grips. Her mission, a deliberate attack on a ridgeline objective, including 2 support elements, and a complex casualty evacuation contingency. The planning was flawless. The execution was a nightmare. Halfway up the ridge, the RIs inserted friction by triggering a simulated casualty. The body was heavy, and the slope was unforgiving. The haul system had to be improvised under extreme time pressure in the freezing wind. Saela felt a surge of frustration, not at her team, but at the stubborn laws of physics. Joran saw the flicker of anger in her eyes. "Slow is smooth," he reminded her quietly. She exhaled, a plume of white steam, and recentered. She reissued the orders with a calm, flat voice. The evacuation succeeded, but the timeline was blown. In the AAR, the RI didn't critique the knots or the timing. He asked a different question. "What almost broke?" Saela hesitated, searching for the truth. "Control," she said finally. "Of what?" "Myself." The RI nodded once. "Platoon command is emotional management." By day 9, something fundamental shifted. The wolves began to move differently. They weren't faster, but they were more deliberate. Orders became shorter, clearer, stripped of all unnecessary noise. Elowen stopped overbriefing. Nira delegated with precision. Marcus double-checked his azimuth without ego. Saela paused before reacting. The pack bond was still there, but it was now governed by discipline. During a HUD-hit night recon mission at 3,200 feet, with a wind that threatened to blow them off the peak, they established an observation post, OP, overlooking a valley. Below them, the flickers of OPFOR fires danced in the dark. The wolves lay prone in the wet leaves, observing. No one spoke. 40 bodies aligned in a perfect, predatory silence. They weren't quiet because they were told to be. They were quiet because they understood. Darby had built their competence. The mountain phase was building their trust. Not an emotional trust, but an operational trust. The absolute certainty that the element on your flank would be exactly where they were supposed to be when the clock hit 0. The culminating operation arrived without warning. An extended patrol, multiple objectives, limited resupply, 0 sleep. They were metabolically drained, leaner, sharper, their eyes sunken but alert. Naira and Elowen rotated as platoon leader and platoon sergeant mid-mission. The transfer of control was seamless, a fluid transition of authority that actually impressed the RIS. During the final assault, a combination of fog and rain killed all visibility. A human unit would have struggled to maintain formation. The wolves compensated using their instincts, but they stayed disciplined. No instinct overrides, just training. The assault synchronized perfectly. The support element initiated at H hour exactly. The assault maneuvered cleanly. Security was established without a single point of confusion. For the first time, a platoon mission concluded without major friction. After exfiltration, soaked and hollow-eyed, they assembled on the uneven ground. The senior Hor-Rai looked at them. "Squads win fights," he said, letting the mountain wind fill the silence. "Platoons sustain them." He scanned the faces: Naira, Elowen, Saela, Joran, Marcus. "You're not ready to command war," he said. "A beat. But you're no longer dangerous to yourselves." It was the highest compliment they could have received. The mountain phase had not broken them physically. Instead, it had stripped away their illusions. They had learned that leadership was not dominance. It was the responsibility for variables you cannot control. It was clarity in the face of hunger. It was patience in the face of exhaustion. It was humility in the wake of failure. As they stepped off the final ridge that night, moving back toward Camp Merrill, no one celebrated. They were thinner. They were quieter. They were more deliberate. The wolves were no longer reacting to the terrain. They were accounting for it. And in the mountains of North Georgia, that was the difference between surviving and leading. Mountain technique and tactics. Altitude stripped comfort away quietly. There was no dramatic threshold where the wolves felt themselves cross into danger. No warning siren, no ceremonial marker. There was only the slow, insistent theft of oxygen, a thinning of the air that turned every breath into a conscious effort and every movement into a calculation. 3,000 feet was not extreme by civilian standards, but for the wolves, it was a biological tax. Their higher muscle density and accelerated metabolisms demanded more oxygen than a human soldier's. While a human might feel winded, a wolf felt a systemic drain. Fatigue didn't just settle in their muscles. It sank into the bone and stayed there, a cold, heavy weight that refused to be shaken. The wolves arrived on the ridgelines before sunrise, boots scraping against granite, packs biting into shoulders already worn raw by weeks of continuous movement. The terrain folded sharply, knife-edged spines of rock dropping into ravines that swallowed sound and light. Ancient pines, twisted sideways by decades of unrelenting wind, leaned over the slopes like silent spectators who had seen 1,000 men fail here and expected the wolves to be no different. A ranger instructor gestured across the valley, his face a mask of indifference. "Everything you learned previously," he said, his voice steady and thin in the cold air. "Assume it can fail here." There was no elaboration. There was only the order to move. Mountain movement was not about speed. It was about the brutal economy of motion. The wolves had to unlearn their predatory instincts. In the wild, they would bound, leap, and sprint. But here, those bursts of power were expensive. They learned quickly that bounding wasted oxygen they didn't have. Power had to be rationed like ammunition. Spacing became more critical than formation. Too close, and a single slip on a shale slope could trigger a landslide that took 3 men down. Too far, and command dissolved into a series of disconnected echoes. Hand signals replaced voices. The thick fog of their own breath made sound discipline difficult, and the wind carried whispers unpredictably across the ridges. They learned to move with the terrain, not against it. They traded straight climbs for grueling switchbacks and vertical pushes for long, sweeping traverses. They angled their feet outward to preserve their calves and improvised poles from fallen branches when their issued gear snapped under the weight of the climb. The first movement lanes were conducted in daylight. Then the weight increased. Weapons came off the slings and into their hands. Rucks grew heavier, not with more supplies, but with the burden of responsibility. Radios, demolition kits, and casualty litters folded and strapped awkwardly to their packs. Altitude punished arrogance immediately. One wolf tried to power up a steep face too quickly, relying on raw strength to conquer the incline. He didn't fall, but the biological cost was instant. His breathing spiked into a ragged gasp. Tunnel vision crept in, and he was forced to stop, knees locked, fighting the sudden, terrifying sensation that the mountain itself was pressing down on his chest. No one mocked him. They didn't have the energy. They simply stepped around him in silence, redistributed the weight of his gear, and moved on. It was a cold lesson. Combat at altitude did not forgive individualism. By nightfall, the NVGs came out. Depth perception vanished. The world became a grainy, undulating sea of green. What looked like solid ground was often a shadow. What looked like a shadow was often a void. NVG movement required a complete reprogramming of their instincts. Their peripheral vision collapsed into a narrow tunnel, and slopes flattened deceptively, hiding drop-offs that only appeared once they were already beneath their boots. The wolves moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Their hands touched the rock, constantly, confirming the reality of the ground, one hand always free, one foot always secure. Then came the NVG rappels. The anchor points were set along a cliff face that disappeared into a total blackness. Wind curled upward from the valley, tugging at their uniforms and gear, trying to pull them off the wall. The first wolf stepped to the edge. Under the green glow of the goggles, the void didn't look deep, and that was the danger. "Rope!" he called. "Rope!" came the response. The descent was measured, boots sliding, the rope humming faintly under the friction of the brake. The NVGs distorted the distance, and his brain screamed at him to rush, to get back to solid ground. Training forced him to slow down. Halfway down, the wind shifted, and the rope began to sway. It wasn't a violent movement, but in the void, it felt like a pendulum. He compensated, lowering his center of gravity and increasing his brake pressure until he felt the rock again. At the bottom, he keyed his mic, off rope. One by one they followed. Some descended with mechanical precision. Others fought the instinctive urge to freeze when their visual references lied to them. One wolf hesitated too long, suspended in the green haze. The RRI didn't intervene. He simply watched as the rope creaked under the tension. Finally, the wolf committed, heart rate spiking, breathing ragged. But the system held. At altitude, fear didn't scream. It whispered. Combat lanes began on the third day. Simulated enemy positions were woven into the terrain, rocky overhangs, tree lines along the ridges, and shallow depressions that offered just enough cover to be deceptive. The wolves operated as platoon elements now. The time for squad-only thinking was over. Leaders rotated constantly. A platoon leader focused on movement often lost security. A leader who obsessed over security stalled the progress until daylight burned the mission. Fire and maneuver at altitude demanded an iron restraint. Suppressive fire echoed unpredictably, bouncing off the rock faces and masking both distance and direction. Communication degraded into a series of sharp hand signals and pre-planned actions. Trust was the only thing that functioned. They learned the physics of high-altitude combat, how to shoot uphill, fighting a recoil that pushed differently, and how to shoot downhill, accounting for gravity's subtle shift in trajectory. Reloads were slower, hands were colder. One wolf fumbled a magazine, watching it clatter down the rock and vanish into the darkness. There was no replacement. He adapted. They learned to plan movement routes not just for the assault, but for the evacuation. Every plan included a withdrawal that accounted for gravity, rope availability, and the crushing weight of oxygen debt. Casualty drills at altitude were brutal. A simulated wounded man weighed the same as he did in the valley, but he felt twice as heavy. Lowering a casualty required establishing anchors while under simulated fire, creating cover positions that could see the enemy without being seen, and making life or death decisions while their lungs burned and their judgment was impaired. Mistakes stacked. One patrol pushed too aggressively and exposed their flank. Simulated enemy fire pinned them against a ridgeline with zero cover. The RI ended the lane early. "You're dead," he said flatly. "You just don't know it yet." The wolves absorbed the critique in silence. The final days combined every stressor: night insertion, NVG movement, rope ascent under simulated fire, an objective seizure on a ridge with wind howling loud enough to drown out shouted commands. Leadership fractured and reformed. A normally quiet wolf took command instinctively when the designated leader froze, overwhelmed by competing inputs. He didn't announce his takeover. He just started issuing clear, short commands. The platoon followed without hesitation. When it was over, no one spoke for a long time. They stood on the ridgeline, silhouettes against a sky lightening toward dawn. Below them, layers of blue and grey mountains rolled away endlessly toward the horizon. The RI finally spoke. "This is where small unit tactics stop being theory," he said. "This is where terrain becomes the enemy." The wolves didn't feel a sense of accomplishment. They felt sharpened. They had learned how to fight the mountain without trying to dominate it. They had learned to move with discipline when every instinct screamed to rush. They had learned to lead when the oxygen was gone and thinking felt like a physical chore. Ahead waited the final evaluations. But the mountain had already delivered its verdict. They were no longer just enduring. They were operating. Evaluation. Evaluation did not announce itself with a fanfare or a briefing. There was no ceremonial marker to signal that the margin for error had narrowed to zero. The wolves knew the shift had happened only because the ranger instructors changed, not in their tone or their volume, but in their presence. They stopped intervening. When a mistake was made, no correction followed. When a decision went wrong, there was no immediate shouting, no demand for a push-up, no coaching on how to fix the flaw. There was only a heavy, oppressive silence and the rhythmic scratch of a pen moving across a waterproof notepad. The RIS had transitioned from teachers to judges. The mountains were already cold when the evaluation began. But by the third night, the weather turned hostile. Snow crept down from the higher elevations and stayed, coating the pines in a brittle white shroud and stiffening the ropes into frozen cables. It erased tracks almost as fast as they were made, turning the forest into a featureless void. Breath steamed constantly now, betrayal in every exhale, revealing positions to any simulated enemy unless discipline held perfectly. Fingers lost feeling in seconds if gloves were removed. Dexterity became a resource to be rationed as carefully as ammunition. Then there was the hunger. Calories were almost gone. 2 meals a day had become one, and sometimes that one meal was a fragmented remains of an MRE shared between 3 men. Hunger was no longer a sharp pain. It had evolved into a dull, heavy, ever-present fog. It slowed their cognitive processing, shortened their tempers, and narrowed their vision. The wolves moved through it not because they were strong, but because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant failure. The first leadership rotation came without ceremony. A wolf was designated platoon leader. Another, platoon sergeant. Squad leaders were assigned beneath them, and maps, already damp and curling at the edges, were handed out. Mission was simple on paper. Move the platoon across broken terrain, establish a patrol base, conduct reconnaissance of a suspected enemy position, and transition to a raid, ambush, or withdrawal based on the conditions. Nothing about it was simple. The platoon leader chose speed. He selected a route that shaved distance, but demanded brutal elevation, steep, vertical climbs that punished calves and lungs already struggling with the thin air. Early on, the gamble seemed to pay off. They made time. Morale held. Then the mountain pushed back. The snow thickened, turning the shale into a slide of ice. Footing worsened. One wolf slipped and caught himself on a frozen root, his ruck swinging out over empty void, nearly pulling him into the ravine. Another stumbled and went down hard, the impact knocking the breath from his chest in a ragged gasp. Spacing stretched, control frayed. By the time the patrol base was established, they were behind schedule and bleeding energy they couldn't replace. Security was set, but it was shallow. The platoon sergeant missed a critical piece of dead space, a narrow, shadowed draw that allowed an enemy element to approach unseen. When the ranger instructor stepped into view from that draw, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. "You're dead," he said calmly. No explanation followed. No feedback was given. The patrol ended there. Later, during the peer evaluations, the wolves were blunt. There was no room for politeness. He didn't listen when we flagged the route. He chased the clock instead of the control. He didn't adjust when the conditions changed. There was no anger in these critiques, no grudges. Evaluation stripped emotion away, leaving only the cold, hard facts of operational failure. The next rotation flipped the dynamic. The new platoon leader slowed everything down. He favored control over momentum and security over speed. Movement was deliberate, almost agonizingly slow. Halts were enforced early, before exhaustion could demand them. The platoon arrived at the objective late, but they arrived intact. When the snow began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets, he adjusted the spacing, tightened the intervals, and ordered short, disciplined halts to prevent cold injuries. The patrol base they established was ugly, cramped, and inefficient, but it was secure. This time, when the ranger instructor moved to exploit a gap, he was seen and neutralized. The patrol continued. Leadership rotated again and again over the following days. Every wolf took a turn in command, whether they wanted it or not. Some thrived early and collapsed as the hunger deepened. Others struggled at first, then found a strange, crystalline clarity as their bodies failed and instinct finally gave way to absolute discipline. One wolf failed quietly. As a squad leader, he rushed the setup of an anchor during a descent. His fingers were numb, his mind fogged by sleep deprivation, and he skipped a redundancy check. The rope held, but the system was fundamentally flawed. The ranger instructor stopped him before the descent began. "Explain your anchor." The explanation faltered halfway through. The wolf realized his mistake in real time, the error staring back at him from the webbing. "Relieved," the RI said, flat and final. The wolf stepped aside without protest. No one argued. He rejoined the formation and continued the patrol as a rifleman, the weight of his failure heavier than the pack on his back. Leadership here was not a reward. It was a burden, carried only as long as your judgment remained intact. The hardest patrol came near the end. Night movement. Heavy snow. NVGs were distorted by falling flakes that reflected the infrared light back into the wolves' eyes, creating a tunnel of green static. Depth vanished. Slopes became deceptive. Midway through a narrow saddle between two peaks, a simulated casualty was introduced. Dead weight. A body that didn't help itself. The platoon halted. The acting platoon leader had seconds to decide. Continue toward the objective and risk losing control of the unit, or establish a hasty defense, request an extraction that existed only in the scenario, and accept that the mission had failed. No help was coming. The decision itself was the test. He chose to continue. At first, the decision held. The platoon adjusted, redistributing the weight of the casualty, rotating carriers and tightening security. But as the hours dragged on, the fatigue compounded. One squad drifted out of position, a flank went uncovered, commands slowed, breathing grew ragged, the falling snow hid the hand signals. When the ranger instructor terminated the patrol at dawn, his voice carried no judgment. "You lost control," he said. "That's when people die." Later, during the peer evaluation, the wolves didn't hesitate. He pushed past our limit. He ignored the warnings from the ground. He wanted the objective more than he wanted the platoon. That decision followed him like a ghost for the rest of the phase. The final rotations blurred together. Roles shifted fluidly now. Platoon leaders acted as platoon sergeants when the situation demanded it. Squad leaders stepped into command without being told. Authority was no longer tied to a designated position. It flowed naturally to whoever saw the terrain most clearly in the moment. One wolf emerged unexpectedly. He was quiet, unremarkable on paper, never the fastest or the loudest of the group. But when he led, things simply worked. Routes made sense. Security was layered. Decisions came early, and when something went wrong, he owned it immediately and adjusted without defensiveness. The ranger instructors noticed. On the final day, the wolves assembled on a ridgeline as snow fell steadily, coating the world in a white, oppressive silence. They were hollow-eyed and bearded, their skin filthy and their hands cracked. Their faces were gaunt, the subcutaneous fat gone, leaving them looking like predatory ghosts. The evaluation ended, not with speeches, but with names. Those who passed did not cheer. They barely reacted. Relief came later, in small, private moments, when the pressure finally lifted enough to be felt. It was the realization that the mountain had taken everything it could from them, and had found them still standing. The ranger instructor addressed them one last time. "This phase doesn't make you strong," he said. "It shows us what's already there." He let the words settle in the freezing air. Passing means you can lead when you're empty. It means you can think when thinking hurts. It means terrain, weather, hunger, and fatigue didn't break your judgment. The wolves moved off the ridge in silence, descending toward Camp Merrill. The snow erased their tracks almost immediately, as if the mountain were already forgetting they had ever been there. They did not feel victorious. They felt measured. They had been tested not against an enemy, but against the mountain, against hunger, and against the darkest parts of their own nature. And they had proven something simple and dangerous. They could lead in places where failure meant death. Ahead waited water, and the water would strip away whatever illusions the mountain had left intact.